Michelle was the former director of inclusion and diversity at Netflix. She does a lot of work with the UN, heading up like the Girls Up campaign, which focuses on empowering women. And she does a lot of work helping women break down barriers within the workplace. And she works with some of the multinational leading organizations across the world on their DEI agendas and future trends and all that sort of stuff. So we've got a lot to dive into today. So hello. And let's kick off with just updating us on what you're up to right now, what you've been up to. The floor's yours.
Well, thank you. Yes. So the last 4 years, I've been running my own consultancy, really focusing on culture change in workplaces. And I've got, which is really important for you all to know, I've got a huge library of content around leadership development programs, cultural change programs, everything from masterclasses to sort of longer form programs. And really trying to help companies build not just inclusive cultures, but high performing cultures. So I've worked with everyone from FIFA to Dior to the World Economic Forum, really looking at how do we change the way these workplaces work. And I also have my first book, which is The Fix. It's based on my PhD, which really looks at how inequality works in workplaces and what we can do to fix it. And then my second book, called How Work Works, is really on the future of work and the way in which workplaces are changing and how we can future-proof our skills to navigate these new sort of workplaces and the new world of work. So really looking at 4 key skills people need to develop. And a lot of that is linked to sort of social and emotional skills. So as AI and automation take over, like how do we make sure we're ready to navigate that? A lot of people focus on the technical side, but actually the gap is really in the social and emotional space. So I've done a lot in that space. And then outside of that, I've got a LinkedIn Learning course coming out. So that is on content related to my second book on meaning at work. So really looking at how managers can make work meaningful, why meaning is so important. I don't know if everybody knows this, but 77% of employees are disengaged at work. And that means they're going into work, they've kind of quietly quit. And that's a huge problem for businesses. It's probably the number one problem facing organizations. We've got Gen Z, 60% of Gen Z employees kind of quitting their jobs each year. There's huge turnover rates, and it's because people are unhappy. And so this course really tries to give managers skills to say, look, how do you meet the needs employees have of work? How do you build a meaningful workplace? And then outside of that, I've just launched a new podcast related to my third book called My Workplace is Killing Me. It's a little bit controversial, but it's all about how do you navigate the most difficult aspects of work. So from burnout to inequality to difficult bosses to bullying, how do we navigate the tough aspects of work, and really looking at toxic or unhealthy workplace cultures and this idea that actually it's a skill, right? And in most workplaces, you're going to navigate difficult elements. So that will be out next year. And the podcast is really, it launched in January, and it's really telling people stories and coaching them through how to navigate these difficult situations. So I'm really trying to help that 77% of people who are disengaged.
I love that. I love the name as well. It's such a provocative title. My Workplace is Killing Me. Did you do a lot of research did you do into toxic organizations that sit down with employees in those organizations? How did you
my PhD was actually on this topic. So looking at the ways in which workplaces don't really work for everybody. And I think one of the sort of mistakes we make is assuming that workplaces work for people in the dominant group, which typically tend to be white men. Actually, they don't. So, in my PhD, I found, and I don't know why we don't talk about this more. I feel like this is a really important topic for International Women's Day and throughout the year, that, there are numerous challenges men face because of inequality, because of toxic workplace cultures. And, they're not given an opportunity to A, understand what those challenges are, and B, kind of how to navigate them and how to change them. So for me, that's kind of one of the biggest surprises in all the research, is just the way in which workplaces cost everybody, just kind of in different amounts, because they're not set up to really champion people to have a positive experience. So my work really centers on that in research, and I'm researching it now as well as part of book number 3. I just think more people would be sort of shocked at just how many workplaces are toxic. And although the title's provocative, it's actually true. When it comes to physical safety, companies are very good at putting in policies and processes to protect people from physical hazards. But what we miss is the ways in which organizational cultures can kill us through toxic behaviors, toxic workplace norms, bullying that leads to things like suicide, mental health challenges. We've just got a huge rate of this happening in workplaces at the moment. 30% of people at any one point in time, roughly 30% of people experience bullying at work. And that leads to sort of chronic stress, fatigue, suicidal thoughts. We've got really high rates of work-related suicide around the world. So for me, talking about the different ways workplaces are toxic, what leaders can do, what employees can do to change that is super important.
Yeah, that's crazy. Because you also so mental health is obviously a massive part of that, but you also underestimate how much stress shaves years and years and years off your life. Like if you're in a toxic relationship, you will literally die 10 years earlier because of the stress on your heart, the cortisol through your body. It's hectic. So,
well, and we often, I find in the narrative around workplaces today, we always go to quite extremes, right? So it's like a toxic workplace. Actually, very few workplaces as academics will be put in the toxic bucket. It's probably more likely a workplace is unhealthy. And again, not all behaviors are bullying. It's much more likely that you experience what we call incivility at work. So incivility has doubled in the last decade, and that is things like people ignoring you when you walk past them, gossiping, underhanded comments in meetings, all of those behaviors that lead to a horrible experience of work and, to your point, cause chronic stress, right, and lead to people. I think for me, what we miss is it's not enough to just have a workplace that isn't negative. What we're actually trying to create is a workplace that's positive. And that's an environment where you find your work fulfilling and meaningful. Now, people often cringe when I say this because they think, well, do I need my job to be meaningful? And my answer is yes, you do, because next to sleep, work is where you spend the most number of hours over your lifetime, as depressing as that is. And 9 out of 10 people want more meaning and fulfillment from work. The problem is they don't know how to get it. And what we need to do is start to think about, what are the needs we have? And if we meet them, will we feel more meaning and fulfillment? So it's educating workplaces on, people want to belong, they want to learn and grow, they want to feel valued. How do we create environments that enable this? So for me, this is really the future of work, is how do you create environments where people feel connected? Because today it's not enough to just go to work and do your job. People want more meaning from work because they're spending more hours there. And your life satisfaction, like how happy you are in life, has a reciprocal relationship with job satisfaction. So if you're unhappy in your life, you're going to be unhappy in work, and if you're unhappy at work, you're going to be unhappy in life. And so finding ways to make work meaningful is absolutely important, because that 77% of people who disengage, that's costing you everything: productivity, innovation, creativity, like across the board. It is a huge burden. In fact, there was one study by Gallup done stating that just in the United States alone, that 77% of disengaged employees costs, from a GDP perspective, $8 billion a year in lost productivity. So, we really need to solve this problem of disengagement at work.
Yeah, that's crazy. But how do you even, if you think of a toxic, unhealthy workplace, and then you bring in someone like you, who's got these amazing, actionable insights, how do you begin to fix that? You've got 77% of a workforce that's disengaged, that's quiet quitting, and then you've got some toxic, unhealthy managers or whatever. How do you even begin to fix that?
Well, I'm a researcher, so we just say it like it is, even if it's not popular. So the first thing I would say is, look, leaders drive culture, culture drives employees' experiences of work. So you have to start with leaders. Leaders are the standard for what good looks like in a workplace in terms of behaviors, and how people behave, that makes up their experience of work. That is culture. So if you just look at something like inclusion, 46% of employees' experiences of inclusion are directly related to their line leaders' behavior. Come on. So if you want to make your culture inclusive, forget unconscious bias training, forget all that other stuff that we know, quite frankly, doesn't really work or has a very small impact at best, and just focus on the behaviors leaders are engaging in. This week, this is going to be a controversial take, but it's absolutely true. We had Mark Zuckerberg come out and talk about this need for more masculinity at work. And what he's really kind of signaling, I was actually, as a researcher, quite grateful that he mentioned that, because I'm like, yes, workplaces are gendered. We have this outdated idea of what good looks like when it comes to leadership. And that standard doesn't serve us today, right? This dominant, assertive, aggressive, competitive, and exclusionary standard that is the standard for leadership and competence. And today, in a world where 82% of people have to collaborate with others to get their job done, we need leaders who can collaborate, who can, help their teams work together, who can delegate, who can coach, who can have difficult conversations, who can create an enabling environment for people to collaborate. And if we think about things like innovation that are your competitive advantage, employees are 6 times more likely to innovate in environments that are inclusive. So for me, the number one priority should be frontline leaders, managers, any people managers should understand that their job is managing how work gets done, not what work gets done. Most employees, I don't need to be told what to do. I need a manager who enables me with managing the how of work. And that's the problem we have today. There's about one study showed 89% of managers don't have any formal managerial training. So you've got a whole bunch of people who look at the outdated leaders in their workplace and think, hey, I'm just going to adopt that transactional way of leading and that's going to work. And it doesn't, right? Because the world of work has changed. So for me, that's the number one priority. And then I think the second thing is, for employees, the world of work has changed. We need to take accountability that we have to manage our own careers, right? And in many ways, we are our workplaces. So building some of these skills that I talk about in my second book around learning how to navigate the new world of work, that is something we have to give ourselves, because your workplace is not going to give it to you. And when you start to do that, you will feel greater levels of engagement.
Yeah. So going back to what you said about Zuckerberg and his wish for masculinity to come back, and it's a nod to sort of bashing wokeism, which I don't agree. Lots of people are annoyed with woke culture in a sense, but also how will that play out in the future for DEI agendas or companies? How's it going to impact your approach to things? Because it's one of the most influential people in the world is coming out and saying this outright, and he's backed by the president-elect of the US and Musk and the most powerful people in the world.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important question. Again, I'm a researcher, so I'm not really interested in people's opinions. Zuckerberg can have an opinion that we need more masculinity in workplaces. My first question is, on what basis do we have that opinion? So none of the research supports that a transactional, command and control, aggressive, dominant, assertive way of leading and working in today's environment makes sense. So most studies show effective leadership today is much more transformational, and that's because leadership is contextual. So in the industrial era in the 1950s, where people work in factories, you go in, you do a little job, you leave, it's very hierarchical. That transactional approach makes a ton of sense. Doesn't in today's environment where you've got hybrid working, you've got the digital economy, you've got really diverse workplaces, right? They've become a lot more demographically diverse. You've got people with different perspectives. You need leaders who are much more transformational, democratic, caring, empathetic, that style of leadership. And so for me, it's less about what people's opinions are, more about recognizing the context that we operate in has changed. So the way we lead needs to change with it. And it's not about saying, we miss our outdated gender norms. It's about recognizing that to be effective, to compete, you need teams that collaborate, that innovate, that create, that problem solve. And you're only going to get that in a world where leaders lead in a much more effective way than they have been. And all the disengagement, all the problems workplaces face today fundamentally come down to the fact that we've not recognized we have to change. And I think companies that get this right, like I sort of laugh when Zuckerberg says that, because I'm like, please go ahead and carry on down the path, because you will not be able to innovate. You will not be able to create, great minds don't think alike, and we need leaders who can foster diverse perspectives and help people collaborate. So the companies that stick with their agendas and really focus on creating not just diverse, but more importantly, inclusive cultures, they will have the competitive advantage purely just from innovation alone, let alone alone everything else, like high rates of employee engagement, all the rest of it.
For such an intelligent man, it's such an ignorant comment because it's just going to create more division within companies. And
I mean, I'm hugely empathetic in some ways. So, and maybe it's because I took a year just to study white men's experiences of work. But I feel like in many ways, diversity and inclusion has failed white men. So I asked 735 white men working in professional services, what's the number one barrier to your advancement at work? And they said DEI initiatives focused on women, right? So there's this idea that, something has been taken away from them. It's a zero-sum game, and companies are to blame for the way in which they position DEI initiatives with targets, with quotas, with this idea that we're going to force this and it's a win-lose sort of orientation. And I think he's really talking to that, like the sense of, backlash that we're seeing is because we haven't approached DEI in the right way. I don't approach it in that way. So for me, it's much more about how can we create enabling environments that allow everyone to succeed? What does a culture look like where we value differences? And how do we give people the skills to value differences? What does that look like? And that is a much more sustainable and effective way of approaching DEI. So I'm actually quite sympathetic to many white men feel the same way Mark Zuckerberg does. He's actually capturing that feeling. It's just an uneducated opinion. So I'd love to have a chat with him to.
Yeah, I was going to say, if he said it the way that you just said it, it makes sense. I've heard that, and I feel sorry for some, white men walking on eggshells at work, and they feel like they've got a target on their back in a way. But I think someone with such a massive platform and with so many resources at his disposal should be able to maybe put it across in a way where we can see it the way that you've just said it, because it could be quite detrimental to other companies that sort of look to him as this hero. Anyway, enough about that. Or do you want to talk more about that?
No, I'm good. Yeah.
Enough about Zuckerberg. So sort of what we were talking about a little bit in that discussion is DEI, how this will impact DEI agendas. So do you think that this will, considering that, and then also maybe considering what's happening in the world with political instability and major focus on AI and innovation and that whole thing?
Yeah, look, I think
Isn't as much of a priority. Sorry.
Yeah, when it comes to DEI in general, I do think common approaches have failed. So if we look at, I have a really good slide on this that I do in most of my talks, on, what are the go-to DEI initiatives most companies put in place, right? It's things like unconscious bias training. There's tons of research showing that's ineffective. It's things like policy changes, process changes, women-focused mentoring, women-focused networking, ERGs. And out of all of those, probably the most effective one is employee resource groups, or ERGs. But everything else doesn't really change it. And if you think about it, like, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? A lot of companies don't actually know or haven't articulated that. And you would never approach any other business problem in that way. So my PhD literally tried to define, how does inequality work in workplaces? What is the problem we're trying to solve for? And when it comes down to it, the problem we're trying to solve for is this idea that there's one way of working and one way of leading, which is this outdated sort of hyper-masculine way of leading, that is the most effective. So anyone who's different from that is going to be devalued in some way, right? So if you are different from the white, heterosexual, able-bodied male norm, you are going to experience challenges in your workplace because you're not going to be valued in the same way as people who fit that ideal. Same thing for behaviors. And the problem is a lot of DEI initiatives don't address that. And how that plays out is in day-to-day lived experiences of work. It's not a policy or process. You can see it in policies and processes, like the fact that we don't have paternity leave, so you suddenly got to add that in, right? Or you don't have bathrooms that are gender, you've got to add that in because workplaces weren't designed for difference, they were designed for this ideal. But what we don't recognize is actually it's not just about policies and processes, it's practices, it's the day-to-day behaviors we engage in that reinforce the standard. So a good example of this is, I've shared this story quite widely. The first day I became a manager, I walked into my shared kitchen at work and my boss picked up the kitchen tea towel and he threw it across the room and he said, "Hey, Michelle, you're a woman, why don't you wash the dishes?" Now, when I tell that story, people are shocked, right? And they're like, that's terrible. That would never happen today. Not true, right? 95% of people witness or experience moments like that in their workplace on a regular basis. And those moments sort of serve to reinforce the standard. So if you look at it purely as a researcher, makes a lot of sense. My boss was trying to align with this outdated standard by engaging in behaviors associated with it and distance himself from me, who's different. And so I think what we have to do is start managing the moments that matter, because that's how you solve this problem. And a lot of DEI initiatives have failed because that's what they are missing. Like, if you're not putting initiatives in place to manage the kitchen moments, you're not actually tackling inequality at work.
You also do a lot of research and focus a lot on women and them overcoming either invisible barriers within the workplace. And when I was looking more into that for this interview, I was thinking, how many women are facing these sort of barriers and they don't even know? They just see things as norms within society, norms within workplaces, and they don't even know that they are subject to these sort of things within the organization. So how can those women sort of change that? How can general women overcome barriers in the workplace? What are your sort of top tips on that?
It's a really important question, because it's not just that. So I think there's sort of different camps women tend to fall into. So they're women who, like men, will deny it. So say, no, my workplace is a meritocracy, everybody's treated in the same way. And normally, typically, what you'll find is those women actually fit that outdated standard. So they are engaging in dominant, assertive, aggressive behaviors, right? Because anyone can try and live up to that standard. So, you see their workplaces sort of work for them. It costs women to do that, but they're women who fit that standard, right? And then what you'll see is there's a bunch of women who are just new in their careers and don't know. So I talk about this in my book, how younger generations of women will often think gender inequality be a problem for some other people, but not them, right? This idea that I'm going to be the exception. So within the first 3 years of working life, young women, and if any of you have children or sisters or daughters, who are sort of entering the workforce, I want you to pay attention to this. So, within the first 3 years of working life, young women's confidence in their ability to advance drops by more than 63%, right? They suddenly go from thinking, I can be a leader, to actually, I don't think I'm going to make it here. And it's because they enter their workplace, take a look around at the behaviors, experiencing, the side effects of leaders engaging in those behaviors, and they're like, not for me. And this is a real problem in workplaces. So I think there's a camp that just don't know because they've not been in workplaces and they believe they're going to be exempt from this. There's a camp that reinforce it. And then there's just a bunch of women that want to deny it because it's painful. It's a painful thing to admit that your co-workers don't value you in the same way as maybe they do other people. And it's a painful thing to talk about these experiences. And so for me, educating people on differences and different lived experiences in workplaces is the number one priority, because that's how we start to see the way in which actually workplaces don't really work for anybody. So a good example is in my kitchen moment, the men who were standing around and heard my boss say that, they came up to me afterwards and were like, I'm so sorry, that was so awful, I felt terrible, because it's actually threatening to them. I mean, one of my favorite studies shows that when you witness inequality, right, like a kitchen example, it has the same detrimental impact on your mental and emotional well-being as it does the person who's on the receiving end of it directly. And that means, inequality isn't my problem to solve, it's our problem to solve, because a workplace where I can be devalued is a workplace where you can be devalued.
So another thing that you talk about is people future-proofing their careers, which I feel is the most applicable sort of thing to talk about right now, because everyone is freaking out about AI. Will I have a job? Will robots take my job? What will work look like in 5 years, 10 years? It's more up in the air than ever before. So what do people need to do?
Yeah, look, I think my big takeaway from all the research on this, because my books tend to be research-based nonfiction, so there's just hundreds and thousands actually of footnotes linking to different journal articles I've read, is that workplaces are going to become more informal, right? So if you even think about your organization, what you will absolutely see is flatter organizational structures over time, self-managing teams, So, performance reviews, things like bonuses are slowly going to be decided by people you work with rather than a manager. You're going to see workplaces where navigating how work gets done in terms of collaborating and meeting with people and influencing and persuading is going to be a lot more important than tasks you undertake. As AI kind of takes on some of those more sort of day-to-day tasks, the ability to do all the soft stuff is way more important. And there's a ton of studies in the book that talk to this, right, and really make the case for it. So bottom line is managing how we do work is going to be more important than simply what we do. And a lot of people are really rubbish at the how because there's a ton of ambiguity in it, right? So when you are talking to people, when you're trying to influence and persuade, all of that's quite ambiguous. And we are in a moment in time where workplaces are becoming more ambiguous, but our tolerance for ambiguity is actually declining. And there's a bunch of reasons as to why that is. So social media, if you want to date somebody, you don't go to a bar and look at them across the room and try and work out if they're looking at you and then have to make a move and talk and navigate all the social complexities of that. You literally swipe left or right. And so the skill is declining. So for me, it's really understanding when we say the how of work, what do we mean? So there's 4 parts to this. It's really informal networks. It's building your understanding of sort of yourself and others, so self-awareness. It's understanding how to learn informally, and it's also understanding how informal advancement or career management happens, right? And when you can master those 4 things, you'll not only be more effective at work, but you'll also be able to manage your career. So we know overwhelmingly most people don't have a career management plan, and you need it because your workplace is not going to manage your career, right? So it's really about understanding, like, how do I manage my career? That's a skill. So for me, those are the things I would focus on to really start to build some of the skills to navigate this world that is changing and has changed.
Yeah, people skills are almost more important than ever, and critical thinking. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I agree with everything you said. So moving on to cross-cultural competency, which is also something that you help organizations with, and you talk about why this is also increasingly important. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more for us?
I just find it so strange in the DEI world that this hasn't had more airtime. I think, if you park everything, cross-cultural competence is probably the most important thing. A McKinsey 2020 study showed workplaces become more demographically diverse, but actually less inclusive. That's incredible, right? So it means we're not valuing the diversity we're bringing into organizations. And so for me, cultural competence is really made up of cultural awareness. So understanding, and I've got tools and models and frameworks for how you can build this skill, but being able to understand your culture and any other culture you're operating in. And as someone who has lived in South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, all throughout the United States, now in England, I've worked in Syria, Libya, the Netherlands, you name it. Having that skill is super important. Most people don't even recognize their own cultural norms, which makes it impossible to understand others. So it's like a good example of this is people who say, oh, you have such a great accent. I wish I had an accent. It's like, what do you mean? Of course you have an accent. But it's just, without that awareness, it's really difficult. Then the second piece is building what we call cultural sensitivity. So if you're in a different cultural context, or even in a team meeting, working with people who maybe come from Germany or people who maybe are from the Netherlands, being able to instantly understand, like on average, what's the dominant way that people in that culture are likely to behave, and how do I adjust my style to support that, right? So whether it's tends to be more hierarchical, tends to be more informal, tends to be more formal, what are the different ways? So I've got a model, again, for understanding cultural differences and how to adapt. And then the final piece is that cultural competence, so that ability to actually adjust your behavior in terms of your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to make sure that you're actually accommodating and supporting somebody else's cultural norms. If you don't get this right in teams, it's so easy for people to have high degrees of conflict that are actually quite unhealthy. So, understanding cultural differences is such a core skill for the future of work as workplaces continue to become more demographically diverse. And just on the demographically diverse, but before sort of we end there, by 2050, nearly half of all America is going to be made up of people from typically underrepresented groups. And, by and large, that diversity, it's kind of the same skill. So it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close, right? In terms of being aware of your own identities and norms and values, how that impacts others, and then how to manage that. So if you can build your cross-cultural competence, you should be able to work in much more diverse teams.
As someone that does so much research, you're a researcher, you pull all these fascinating statistics and data-driven insights from proper research. I don't even know if that's makes sense, because you can tell I'm not a researcher, unfortunately. So if you could, I thought it'd be quite fun if you could think of like maybe top 3 or 5 future trends that you think would be interesting for us to know about. Maybe some of them you've said already and you just want to highlight again, or some new things that you want to share.
Yeah, look, I think my number one, and this is why I'm writing my third book, right? So as a writer, you always have to think of what's coming next, and I pay huge attention to where the market's going. I work with big publishers; they also pay attention. I think a couple of things are showing up that I'm really interested in, and the book's going to focus on. The first is agency. So this idea that, if I take action, it's going to result in certain outcomes, that's declining. So we're seeing, this quiet quitting phenomenon where people kind of give up and stop trying and just do the bare minimum at work because they think their workplace sucks and they can't afford to leave. That is a real problem, because what it's showing is this lack of agency, and people are unhappy and they don't know what to do about it. So I think building agency in your workplace, super, super important. I think the second thing is, if you park DEI and park inequality, park all of this stuff, building meaningful workplaces, it should be the number one priority for leaders because of that 77%. I'm writing my third book because of that statistic. That is in a study of 120,000 employees across 87 countries. The fact that so many people get up every day, don't want to go to work, hate their job, that's what keeps me going, because we have to solve for that. Life is too short. There's so many unhappy people because they hate their jobs and they don't know what to do about it. So thinking about how can you help managers build meaningful cultures? How can you help employees help themselves? Like, what does that actually look like? For me, that's a big area that I don't know why we're not talking enough about it. And then I think finally, for me, in a world where 82% of people have to collaborate with others to do their job, I think understanding what that practically means for people is really important. So how do we give people the tools and skills to work with others, to bridge their differences, to have hard conversations, to give and receive feedback? And the reason that matters is because of this trend that mid-level manager roles are going to disappear. So AI absolutely is going to get rid of that layer, because you don't need it. You don't need mid-level managers telling people what to do, right? You need people who can coach, who can delegate and give feedback. And this idea of self-managing teams, that is absolutely going to be the case. So we have to learn how to work much more effectively with your co-workers. I mean, most learning happens from your peers. Most of your belonging happens through the connections you form. So knowing, how do I build relationships at work? How do I work with others, particularly if they're difficult or if I don't like them or if they're different from me? That is a core skill that we have to really develop.
Is the statistic of 77% of employees are disengaged a global?
It's a global study. So that's the Gallup 2024 study. That is what I call a mega study. And this is a mega trend. And if I was a CEO, it would be the thing that would worry me the most, because engagement, everything a leader wants from its people, everything a company wants from its people, everything a leader wants from their people, is on the other side of engagement, right? Engagement is the mechanism that leads to productivity, job satisfaction, low turnover, right? Really high rates of innovation. Everything you want is really an outcome of engagement. And in a world where so many people are disengaged, only 23% of people like their job. And, you know, what disappears with this is what we call discretionary effort, right? So people are not only unhappy, but they disengaging, they put in the bare minimum, they just do what's in their job description. I mean, that statistic I think about every day because, you know, what does that mean for lost productivity, for lost happiness, for workplaces? That is hugely, hugely problematic.
If I was a CEO and I saw that statistic of 77% of employees are disengaged, I would book you immediately. So I think that's quite brilliant. Serves you well.
I don't know why. I think a lot of CEOs will go, that's not my workplace, right? That's what I get. And I'm actually working with a company now in Canada whose culture survey data came back kind of okay. So they were like, this isn't a problem for us. And I said, let me go and talk to people. Let me go and do my own research because the survey has not actually assessed any of the stuff. And we've gone and found exactly the same thing. They have astronomical rates of burnout. So burnout's a key contributor to disengagement, and it's because managers aren't managing workloads effectively, aren't helping teams work effectively together. So, you know, a lot of companies, I think, are in denial about how disengaged employees are.
Oof, it's crazy. Okay, thank you for those interesting things, statistics. So just a reminder to the audience that you can pop any questions that you have for Michelle in the Q&A. So I think I'm just going to kick off with that now because we already got one question from Caroline. I'm sure you know Caroline.
Yep.
She said, hi, I've got a practical question for you. I'm not getting some traction for promoting International Women's Day as in previous years within the US. Based on what you said, should I play down the woman emphasis and focus more on changes within workplaces as you have described? Should we or you change your bio and profile with us?
Please, please. So I am actually about to, I have a really big newsletter with quite a large subscription, and I'm about to do a newsletter this week on IWD. So the theme for this year's International Women's Day, whether you support the organization that arranges the theme or not, it is the theme, is action, right? It's all about action for equity. And my problem with this is we talk to rooms of women, and actually it's a problem companies have, right? They want to engage men in this. I feel the topic we should be talking about is, you know, how inequality costs men, how men actually need gender equality more than women, right? Why it is that, you know, men only stand to benefit from this. So the more we can have topics centered to engaging and enrolling men, I feel is really important. And every IWD, it's actually quite misogynistic. We only talk to women about a problem that, you know, they play quite a small role in creating and actually have very limited opportunity to solve for. We can't solve inequality on our own. It's going to take everybody. So I think topics related to men are super important. And then the reframe from DEI, I find DEI such an unhelpful framing for all of this. To really look, being able to value difference is a core skill for the future world of work. And it's something both men and women need, right? Any individual needs in their workplace. And so how do we build the skill? And that is the second book. And when I've had opportunities to talk to the 4 ways you can future-proof your career, it just so happens that is a more inclusive, more equitable way of working. You know, people love it because suddenly you're giving them practical things they can do around how do I build my informal networks? How do I build my self-awareness and other awareness? How do I learn informally on the job? How do I advance my career in this new world of work? You're giving them skills to navigate this. So for me, it's trying to think about, you know, what do people care about at the moment? They care about that, right? And the final bit is really around meaning. So how can we make work meaningful in a world where so many of us are disengaged because of inequality, because of inequity? How do we make work meaningful? I would love any feedback from any of you on my bio. I'm not great at selling myself. I'm just not, right? It's not a core skill. So if you're like, look, I think you should change this and add more of this in, I would love feedback. I will do that in a heartbeat. You've got free reign. You know, I try to update my website regularly with the speaking topics. I try and position it. But happy, and I've even got a whole team behind me, a whole company who can put together videos on me talking about the different topics for IWD. So if any of that's of interest, just please let me know because I'd love to do it.
Caroline says, fantastic insight. Thank you very much. The men aren't in the room. So that's great. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But Michelle, it's been amazing to sit down with you. I feel like you're an encyclopedia of knowledge and statistic and research, which is amazing because it cuts through all the noise. You've got so many opinions, so many different agendas, and people hate wokeism, people are left, people are right, and you cannot argue with a statistic. And that's what you give lead.
One thing before we go, I just want to say a really big thank you to London Speakers Bureau, not just because you booked me, but you are by far the most professional organization in the space. And I don't say that lightly. Like, I have lots of companies trying to, and that anytime Kay knows this, that I've engaged them, it's been, so I just have, so much respect and support for the work that you do, and Kay in particular for putting up with me. I just really appreciate all of you. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my work. It is honestly one of my favorite things. So I've developed hugely in the last 4 years, and it's thanks to all of you. And it can't be easy getting out there and having to sell, particularly on topics like this at the moment. So just thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you. I'm sure that the consultants would really appreciate that. And thank you, because you've done so much work for us, and you always deliver. You're very professional, and you are the real deal, which is really important in this industry. So it's been such a pleasure sitting down with you. I wish we had more time, because I wish I could pick your brain a bit more. And thank you to everyone who joined. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your time.